We can start.
Cool. Welcome everybody to this morning's OD talk on organizational trauma. I see some new faces and welcome back some of our regulars. Thank you for participating in these sessions. We've really grown to love them, and the topics every week are just showstoppers. But before we get going, I just wanted to share a bit about us, World's View Academy, and who we are and how this all fits in. So we're a specialist OD academy. And for those of you who are new to the term organization development, a fairly straightforward definition is we help develop, improve, change, and maximize systems. And systems could be anything from a little team to a massive enterprise. And some of the things that we do in that space is we train first-class OD practitioners, we develop leadership and management capability at all levels of the organization, and help teams accelerate their performance in a healthy and effective way. We also like to work on big and interesting issues like organizational resilience and performance through dealing with things like organizational trauma, as an example. So welcome everyone, and please feel free to share our OD talks with your friends and colleagues, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Everything's up there. This video will be there by tomorrow morning, hopefully. Yes, and I'm looking forward to this chat. If you have any questions or want to just say hi or comments, below in your window, there's a little speech bubble where you can click on and then ask questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that during the talk. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Vasintha to our conversation this morning. She's joined us many times in our morning OD check-in and has been working in organizational trauma for quite some time. And in conversation with Christo, who also has done some significant thinking around organizational trauma and ran one of our campaigns on trauma, which was one of our most well-attended ones. And I'm really looking forward to this topic, because I think everyone is traumatized. Our organizations are going through something we've never had to navigate. So I'm looking forward to some keen insights and a great conversation. So over to you, Christo.
Thank you, Roy. Good morning, everyone. And especially morning to Vasintha, who's for our dialogue, for our chat this morning. It's so nice. And it's a difficult and a challenging topic. And just before the lockdown, we picked up the connection, but we've been around together in the organization development community for a long time, but we started picking up this lockdown happened. And we actually went into deep crisis at exactly the moment where we needed to talk about what we are talking about today, which is organizational trauma. Roy mentioned the OD cafe that we did last year. The theme of the cafe was navigating traumatic organizational change, navigating traumatic organizational change. So we were focusing specifically on change in that workshop. But what struck me, I mean, I rushed in there like a fool, thinking, okay, I'm going to put something together and do some thinking about this thing. And then almost 100 people turned up at the cafe. It's like, okay, this is actually important. People are drawn by this in a way that I did not expect. And And what also struck me about that cafe was the real need of the people who attended that cafe to engage around trauma in the organization and traumatic change, and to have it recognized in some way, because I think to a large extent it is unrecognized. It is something that we gloss over. So Vasintha, after that, of course, after that, I realized that, okay, there's a lot of other people also working in in this field, and there's a lot of good work being done, and it's quite a strong theme, and people like yourself are working inside organizations with trauma. And people like Thomas Hubel is working globally with things like collective trauma and witnessing of collective trauma and the release of collective trauma, which is of course something that the whole point that this trauma is collective trauma, not only individual trauma, is an important one. And then, of course, as time goes on, I start to doubt. I'm thinking like, okay, are we overstating the case? Are we calling things trauma that's not trauma? Are we watering down this idea of trauma? Should we make a distinction between organizational trauma and individual trauma on the one hand? The same way that people like Bessel van der Kolk makes a distinguishes in individual trauma between PTSD trauma, that is very specific events, trauma coming from events, and trauma that he calls developmental trauma, which is ongoing traumatization, I guess, during the childhood years. So I'm also thinking about the organization. There's traumatic events in the life of the organization or in the world of the organization. And then there's probably ongoing traumatization. There's the complexity of traumatization in the organization, not just the organization itself, but we live in an extremely traumatized society. And how do we define this space of organizational trauma? I guess that's almost the start. And I'm sorry, I'm starting here with a whole bunch of questions. You haven't said a word yet. So welcome, and what's your thoughts? How do we even enter into this space?
Thank you, Christo. Hello, everybody. Wow, it is a big question. So, and I think Christo and I've been having this conversation. Obviously, we've been talked a couple of times in terms of where the streams of thinking might go in this conversation, and maybe just to land for all of us that it is, as you pointed out right now, this is not something to kind of just drop in and we can engage with everything. I think with what I've learned in the context of working with trauma is really we have to navigate what are the threads, what's a key thread that makes sense for us today, and let's work with that. What's a thread that makes sense for us in the next moment, and let's work with that. And then together that kind of begins to weave an understanding that helps us to engage with what is trauma. And because it's a word that's like it connects with so many things. So let me share with you a little bit from where I'm going to come from, I think, in this discussion. And we also agreed that this is going to be a very organic conversation so that we can co-create it together, because that's part of this invitation, especially in how we thought we'd like to hold the conversation today, is really to weave it together and generate a a shared understanding together so that we know what this group, might invite and might want to work with. I would say, we talk about defining. So for me, trauma is the experience of a psychologically, emotionally, physiologically traumatic event. That event could be a singular event as it's defined. It could be a singular event as we, understand a singular event. It could have been a death. It could have been a traumatic experience somebody has an accident, something. It could be a personal trauma. It could be trauma as a result of somebody else's trauma. And there's secondary trauma. Trauma could be complex in that it is trauma that I might experience. I might have been abused, and that abuse has lasted a lifetime, and that becomes a complex trauma because it actually influences my thinking and my capacity to function on a daily basis, and that is considered to be complex trauma. And then there is trauma that is trauma, and complex trauma itself is actually divided as well, and there's distinctions between complex trauma, for example, around something like discrimination, something like gender inequality, and what gender inequality brings to women. And what for those of us that are aware of concepts like intersectionality, how does racism and gender intersect, and what's the trauma location of that intersection? So trauma, that's why trauma is a very complex conversation, and my invitation, firstly, learning from the work that I've done, is that we don't engage with that complexity of it, but we need to hold the awareness of it. Is when we can develop a sensitivity to what the possibilities might be, then we have more capacity to engage with those different intersections of where the trauma might be. Because of course, I might have an accident, and I'm going to share this because it's a relatively intimate group. There's trauma as we live in a South African environment, but I very suddenly and unexpectedly lost my mom last Friday. And so that compounds, and how we show up in that, in a working environment, in an organizational context, is the one aspect of this. So I'd like to take one thread, is what is our showing up? How do we show up? The second thread for me, and where I work, because I'm a systemic specialist, I work in the systemic organizational culture, large systems change. So I'm really, really interested in the thread that I focus on, is how do we shape systems in a way that generates the capacity that enables me to, enable is even the wrong word, that elevates my capacity to navigate the trauma that I'm experiencing. So it's not Christo's responsibility to help Vasintha work through her trauma, but if Christo's a leader in an organization, then it's Christo's responsibility to enable an environment that makes me able to show up in the best way that I can show up. And that means I can be healthy. And if I can be healthy in that environment, then I can work through my trauma in a way that is different to if the environment is a toxic environment as a culture or a leadership context. Yeah. So that thread is where my work around trauma in organizations is very deliberate and very focused. So I'm a strengths-based OD specialist. So really working in organizations around how do we shape organizations to elevate strength, to magnify strength, so that the health of the system is a natural outcome. And then inside of that, I can work through what I need to work through because the system allows that to happen. Can I pause there?
Yes.
Is that answering the initial question?
That's a lot of thing, and I want to invite anybody to, if at any point you want to ask a question, stick up your hand or write in the chat box, and please feel free to enter into this conversation.
Wonderful.
And to help this conversation to unfold. That's interesting for me, Vasintha. I think and I want to come back to that question of capacity, because I think in our conversation so far that has become a central theme. I know Thomas Hubel speaks about, somewhere he speaks about the need to in society now, not specifically in organizations, but the need for people with greater resources. And that's the one side, and an important side of it. And then as an organization development practitioner and working, as you say, within the system of the organization and working in a systemic way, we think about that capacity as, on the one hand, individual capacity, and I know, of course, individual capacity is part of it. I think sometimes we overemphasize the individual capacity almost as something that is distinct from or loose from the systemic capacity. So we would maybe over-glamorize the role of leaders, the role of practitioners, and I think to a large extent place too much of a burden on the individual
I think that's
to
the
have
issue.
that capacity.
Exactly. I think that's the issue around mental health, in the way mental health is approached and conventionally, right? Is that mental health belongs to the individual, and that conversation belongs in therapy environment, in a psychotherapeutic environment, in a mental health environment. We don't consider that the organization itself as a unit of existence impacts our mental health on a daily basis, and that we each come in with our own functioning, and whatever level of functioning that is, healthy or unhealthy, depending on what's happening for us in that moment. And then the organization is part of how that gets impacted, and how it is influenced to either come through, be resourced in exactly that language, how I either get resourced or I get weakened. And our role in organization is to constantly check in as individuals, as collectives, as leaders. Are we weakening the system, or are we strengthening the system? What is impeding strengthening? What is reinforcing strengthening? And if we're constantly in that conversation as consultants, as organizational practitioners, as OD specialists, as change specialists, as leaders, and as individuals, because this also, is that it's not this divided, reductionist way in which we have shaped ourselves as organizations. We've got to stop that. There's no such thing. We are collectives. We are communities. We belong in community.
Yeah. Something that you said last week when we chatted, and that struck a note for me, is you spoke about splitting. And it sounds like that's one of the big challenges that we have, is that we are constantly in a kind of a splitting in organizations. It's the management and the organization, it's the people and the rulers, it is me and the system. And in that space, I'm reminded of that quote, and I like my own paraphrase of it, because the original is a bit clumsy. Karl Marx, who said, we make history, but in conditions not of our own making. And it means that we always already find ourselves inside a world or inside a system. And then inside the world and inside that system, we have the challenge of our own agency. To what extent our agency is constrained or enabled, to what extent the system itself adapts in a positive way or maladapts and start to fix certain patterns which can be traumatic patterns or patterns of oppression or suppression, which means that all of that organizational energy gets trapped, and every time the organization or someone in the organization gets traumatized for whatever reason, it just adds to whatever is trapped there inside the organization. And that part of our work is the work of making this split visible.
Absolutely.
Because we can't just take away the split. Yeah.
Sorry, Christo, please finish.
No, yes, that I sometimes end on this funny half statement, half question.
So I was going to point to, and what we were talking about was Otto Scharmer's work, right? Which is really, and in Scharmer it talks about there's a presencing in theory U. There's a presencing moment, and the notion that presencing is like just listen to the system, just presence what's there. And when we're able to listen and go into that deep space of listening to the system, and this word system, I just want to clarify that, we use the language of system, and we talk of collective as an organizational system, but I'm a system as well, as an individual, or we're a system as sitting here as 30 people in this room, we're a system. And so if we are able to just drop our listening to listen with our whole body, listen to the image, listen to people's expressions, listen to the body language, listen to the tone, listen to what's coming from our intuition, at that level of presencing, when we can quieten down, is when we understand that wisdom comes through. Then you can hear the wisdom of the system at a much deeper level. And the opposite of that, so when we can hear wisdom in the system, then we get threads that we go, aha, maybe in a traumatic change context, if I work with this one thread, that will make the shift in this context at this moment, that will enable us to take the healthy next step forward. But the opposite of that is absencing. And when in a context of absencing, that what we have is this incapacity to look at the trauma, incapacity to look at the wound, because that is what we have been conditioned into doing, that is what we have been, it's been too scary to do, and we work in spaces where, we've got that old adage of come in, leave your problems at the door, focus on your work, be productive, goal-oriented, execute, deliver. That's the model, that's the mental model of being in a delivery organizational environment, and then go home. So what we do is we create a split in the organizational context. We create a split. So I'm not supposed to function as a whole human in the system, which is interesting, because if we want to be innovative, if we want to be creative, if we want to shape new ways of being, it's not possible if I can't function in my wholeness. Part of my wisdom comes from my capacity to heal. Part of my capacity to generate, to be generative, comes from my capacity to deal with this wound, with whatever the psychic, emotional, or physiological wounds are. And if I'm creating a split, and we know in a South African context, I mean, in the last month I've been pulled into strange, I don't know why, but this is what happens to us, and we just go with where we're called. I've had conversations with teams around racism because of what's occurred now in this global pandemic environment in the US especially, and what's occurred. So I've been working with teams around racism, and and the split between people of color and white people in the team, because we have we're at different stages of the presencing of what's happened in this country, of the wound in this country. We're at different stages. So we can't work together in partnership until we come to a place where there's a relative meeting point. And that meeting point means everybody has had to have the same safety to be able to come to a meeting point where we can engage with each other in our humanity and rehabilitate the wound, right? Last week I facilitated several conversations around gender inequality. We've had gender absency, the absencing of facing what gender inequality does to people, men and women, for thousands of years. And what that does in an organization, when I feel like I don't have a voice, my voice doesn't matter sufficiently, Roy's voice means more than my voice, he will be listened to more than I will be listened to. So that generates a level of trauma which prevents me from showing up fully. I can't be psychologically safe in a context like that. How am I going to show up? And we have to, because here's the interesting thing, right? The moment that we find ourselves in as humanity right now is that we are dying. That's the reality. Climate shift, we are sitting with the biggest issue as a race. It's on the table staring us in the face right now. And if we're not able to come into spaces where we're creating environments that help people to show up fully so we can develop new solutions, we're actually at the end of a journey that we're absencing the fact that we're in a crisis point as a human race, that we're absencing. Oh, I'm split off. It's somebody else's problem. It's a government's issue. It's a leadership issue. Let Greenpeace deal with it. Where am I in that? What's my responsibility in that? How am I located in that, right? And that's that level, and we have to create environments that, and this is the hardest thing for us to do as human beings right now, as women, as people of color, as people of, I hate using that term, but I'm using it for the sake of our conversation, as previously advantage, disadvantage, whatever our terms are. The work that we have to do is create safety so that we can come into spaces that Greg doesn't feel as a man that he can't have a conversation with me because he has to feel guilty all the time because I'm a woman and I'm going to go, patriarchy, you can't have a conversation. But we have to learn how to come together and meet each other in a space that's safe for both. And we have to have resolve to want to change. As I understand it, as we understand it as systems practitioners, what will happen is, and quantum physics is now showing us that this is true, right? It's no longer a wisdom suggestion. It's what we're proving scientifically, is that the more positivity, the more health that is injected into a system, the system's natural capacity for health will begin to grow. And it'll reach a point where the capacity for health outweighs the capacity for disorder. So not for ill health, but for disorder. And when disorder is no longer the primary or the dominant pattern, we then get healing in a system. And so our way of, in family systems, in social systems, in organizational systems, is how do we inject health, positive development into a system that moves away from disorder. And then the natural capacity will get ignited and unleashed.
So Vasintha, that is a whole lot of things. I, at this point, want to pause and just ask the group that's here. And because it's almost But of witnessing, perhaps, is in your organizations and in your organizational worlds. To what extent do you believe are those worlds traumatized? Are people inside those worlds traumatized? And what's the effect and the impact that you see that arises from where is the pain in the organization? We know there's lots of causes, external causes. Initially.
I'm going to be brave and weigh in a bit.
Thank you.
Feeling a bit vulnerable to speak in front of so many people that I don't know. Having been in corporate for 20 years and then left to go on my own, my last big experience, and also having worked with so many teams in the OD space, this thing of workplace bullying, power over, control, and controls even like with information hoarding, where we don't set people up for success, and it's just people working their pain out on other people inside the company. I think that's where I saw it, and that was quite hard to come to grips with.
Thank you. For me, that's sometimes a strong theme that emerges. Is a theme of, I'm going to call it by its name, persistent organizational violence.
Yeah. That
there is and violence in all of its terms. Violence as Umberto Maturana defines violence as there's no place for you. I will impose my way, regardless. And then violence also as a kind of a violation. In terms of bullying, I had a conversation with a group a few months ago where there was an honest conversation about what's the boundary between bullying and discipline. And it was a very triggering conversation for me because I thought everything that is mentioned there as discipline is bullying. But the conversation was taking place. Vasintha, any response from you?
I think this is one of those moments where it's kind of layered. And thanks, Anesh, for it's such an important question. And we've all experienced bullying in the workplace, right? We've all experienced that kind of behavior. So again, because this is a holistic topic. The individual needs to, we as individuals need to understand how we're behaving and why we're showing up the way we're showing up. And therefore we need to be dealing with our stuff. And so number one, accountability is we need to be dealing with our stuff. So we go and do what we need to do to go and deal with our stuff. And then what we're not doing is we're not projecting it onto everybody else. We're not splitting it off and I'm not making Aneshri the bad person because I don't have the capacity to look at my own shadow, right? Then I'm able to not just the problem with leadership where we talk about having healthy environments and being in community and being cooperative and being collaborative. It's all in my head, but it's not internalized because I can't actually function that way as a human being. Then I'm still reinforcing dynamics that might not enable collaboration. And I want to say here, I think and really from the work in the Center for Gestalt Leadership, and my specialism is that how do we ensure that the system is strong? How do we ensure that the system is healthy? Because it's not the organization's responsibility to make sure Lorna can work with her, whatever's going on for her, but it must elevate her capacity to do so. And that's for me, the invitation that we have right now. So the bullying behavior, if I feel safe, I might choose not to bully Lorna. I might choose to show up in a different way because I feel safe in the environment. And because I am encouraged to go and do the work that I need to do on myself. And then we also have the other element of this, which we mustn't forget as OD specialists, as organizational practitioners, as leaders, is that when we talk systemic, we are talking, what's the structure? How does the structure actually support what we're talking about, right? So if the structures are exclusive, if the structures don't invite safety, then we are reinforcing dynamics. What's the processes and the practices? Initially spoke about power under. So what we really need to do, initially spoke about power over, right? The opposite of power over is power under. Is if under the waterline, if we look at our iceberg model, under the waterline, there's power under. And if I feel like a victim and I don't have power and I'm being bullied and I can't stand up to that, then what we're going to find is sabotage. We're going to find sabotage behaviors, right? We're going to find behaviors where we are now, the only way that I can exercise an element of power is by disempowering you or disempowering others. That's going to show up in, I'm not going to share information. If I have information to share, I'm going to be sabotaging. I'm going to, absenteeism is likely to increase. My health is likely to not be great.
Peter Block makes that beautiful distinction between, he speaks of the patriarchal contract in the workplace and the entrepreneurial contract. And what we have in most workplaces is the patriarchal contract. I think that's our legacy. That's where we come from. It's a relationship of dependency. And inside that dependency, we have to be political to get ahead, or to protect ourselves, or to protect our little domains. And of course, what we resort to is manipulative tactics, like these tactics of undermining, malicious compliance, being there but not being there, massive degrees of disengagement. And systemically, what you're saying, the sensor is, this is how the organization adapts itself. It adapts itself, and that adaptation becomes a kind of a fixation. The whole structure comes to, and I'm not talking only about the hard structure of the organization. You talk about the structure of the culture itself and the way that interactions in the organization are structured, shaped, is in such a way that well, it says to me, don't elevate yourself. I mean, for me, a key example of this kind of thing is an organization that says we want innovation, and we're going to train everyone in innovation techniques. And yet, in the normal course of the organization, we know that you don't speak out with a new idea because it's risky. It's
exactly.
too. So everyone is holding back, and I guess that leads to a kind of organizational fixation.
Well, I mean, you and I had this conversation, so last week I was sharing with, thank goodness I spoke to Christo, because we had a plan to talk about designing and just having a chat about this discussion, right? And then I had come out of facilitating several workshops that were really traumatic for me. And I got bullied because the sponsor didn't agree with the design, even though I knew as the specialist that this was the right flow, right? But I got so clubbed. And even though I knew it was violent, and then I had this, which Christo and I chatted afterward, and I just felt somebody witnessed me, the language you used earlier, like in the conversation, somebody witnessed me, and that I got a view that there was, I was supported in some way, and that somebody professionally went, actually, I agree with you. That feels like the right thing, what you did, And of course, on day 2, the workshop went beautifully because I knew that because of what I'd set up on day one. But on day one, I got so hard hit because the one person didn't agree that that was the right. So we reinforce the dynamics because in leadership, I mean, we're taught in leadership that leadership is the great man theory, the hero, right? Is the lone individual that sits on top of the pyramid, that's got all these amazing traits and is power over the rest of the system. And in order to be a powerful, strong leader, these are the traits I have to have. So structurally, the system is structured so that that one individual has an office that is far away from everybody else. I mean, even in the physical structure, that they are, you can't talk to that person as easily as you can to anybody else. The behaviors are separate from that individual or group of individuals. And so we reinforce and we layer that versus a leader in the center of the network, which is what we're beginning to say needs to shape in organizations in order for something like innovation to be a reality, is that the leader is in the center of the network. And that's also a multitude of networks that are interacting and intersecting all the time. And so imagine that that leader is moving around depending on where that's needed in the organization, right? And then you have movement, not stuckness in a hierarchy. But what we're asking and inviting people to do is give up power. Because we've defined power as a force that has to be imposed. And so Anisha just put in the chat now is that, if we're talking about power with, is a different invitation. How do we shape power with? If we talk about power to, that's also layered because we, in a context that has got lots of power legacy, we have to think about power to very deliberately. And the other power is power within. Is really how are we shaping power within in a way that's healthy, so this dynamic of power under and malicious and manipulative and sabotaging behavior is no longer, it doesn't have to be that, so in depth psychology what we work with is the idea that as we talked, if this is the kind of the vessel, is that, and that's the lines, so the iceberg, so this is the water line, and of course everything we can't see, the power under, is sitting under the water line. So of course what we need to do is very safely bring it up so that we can look at it and we can see it, we can talk about it, and then what happens is it shifts what's down here, and then we can bring up new things, right? And that's why structurally in organizations we have to create safe spaces. Go slow to go fast. All of these things that we talk about that we don't do, these are the things that are going to make the difference for us. This OD check-in that World's View hosts and dear Liesel and Roy have held so beautifully for months. It's just come in, have a safe space. No judge, say what you want to say. Create a space of, everybody kind of leaves there going, wow, I was heard. I felt, and that's the dynamic we have to begin to shape in organization, that it's okay to have that.
Yeah, because we also have a dynamic where much is not okay. And toughness is the norm. And it's a lie, isn't it? It's a lie, the toughness. The contract is a lie because we spoke about it yesterday. I was so shocked about the NASPAS announcement. Because it's all over the press, I will mention it, is that they're closing a whole bunch of publications, reducing the publication of a lot more. It's going to affect, I think, about 500 retrenchments. And a week before that, the annual salary and bonus package for the CEO and the CFO was announced at around, for the two of them, 430 million rand. And so, you know, it's just astonishing. I'm still hoping that someone will explain this to me in a way that actually makes sense to me, except as a very sophisticated form of looting. But yes, the contract in the organization is you do what we tell you to do, you play the game inside the organization, much is not allowed, and a narrow band of things is allowed. And in exchange, we will look after you. You will have a job, and you will make progress in the hierarchy of the bureaucracy, etc. And then we get these moments where it's just exposed as a complete lie. And I can just imagine the amount of world loss that people are experiencing inside those organizations. It is, you had this world, and you had this world where you perhaps had a certain belief about the ethic of your leadership, and also the ethic of the organization as, of course, an entity that exists to be economically productive, make profits, and at the same time as an entity that is deeply embedded inside its community and that serves its community, but also is served by its community, because it's a lie that companies are not served by their communities. I mean, it's not a one-way thing. And inside that space, I think we sit with an enormous crisis. And it's a crisis that when this happens inside the organization, it ripples out to the whole of society.
Absolutely.
And there's a whole collapse of trust. You're going to enter the new organization, probably if you find a job, with the idea that I can't trust the organizational world. The organizational world is not a safe world. I need to get as much as I can get while I'm here. It's a whole pattern that takes place. Also thinking of the survivors in that organization this is traumatizing for you as well. And what's the patterns that are established for you in that moment?
You know, you're reminding me, Christo, of, and if it's, you know, I'd like to share where this started for me, a kind of my deliberate movement to working with organizational trauma. And in 2000, so aside from my own trauma, which is, you know, I've been working for many years around my own healing and understanding how it's impacted me in organizations, and that's the one key stream of my path to this work. The other has been that, so what I learned is one day I went to, I don't know if anybody's been to the Buddhist retreat center in Akopo so I did a weekend retreat, and I went to do Dr. Ian Weinberg is a neurosurgeon in Linksfield Hospital. And he is a pioneer in the thinking of psychoneuroimmunology, right? So psychoneuroimmunology, for those of us that are not familiar, how does our subjective psychology influence our neurological processes? So our literally our neurotransmitters, our chemistry, our neurological chemistry. And what does that mean for our immune system? And how does our immune system respond to that? So the link between psychology, neurology, and our immune systems. And I learned over that process with him. So I did this workshop with him, and then I studied with him for a year after that, because I was so moved by the work. But I learned something, and this was in 2010, 2011. And what I learned with him was the field of psychoneuroimmunology is terrifying for us. And I don't want to, but the word crisis is right. And I think we all must be, I'm going to share this, and then I want to share a healing kind of pathway for us. But we are in crisis, and we need to not absence that. So we have to, the invitation is we have to build our capacity to be present, right? What psychoneuroimmunology teaches us is that there's a nurturing and there's a nature nurturing element to how we shape as individuals, right? In a nurturing context, if there is an element of deprivation, and this of course occurs over a spectrum, right? So it's not the same for everybody, we have to be clear. So just note that. In the context of deprivation, the psychology, the neurology will wire for deprivation. We will wire for deprivation. And that means that as an adult, the individual will be wired to be selfish, to be sabotaging, to be caring, to be giving, to be trusting, to be cutthroat, because of what occurs at a nurture-nature level, and how life then, how the individual's life then either reinforces or changes those dynamics. And what terrified me, we had in that 2012, I remember having, he stopped me from talking to you because I kept interrupting the workshop, because I was terrified, because I said to him, but what does that mean for us in a South African context? Because if nurturing, which is the basis of which apartheid was designed, was we fractured nurturing in this country, what does that mean for majority of our nation, number one? And what does that mean societally in terms of the health of our society, if what we're saying is that we are wired for manipulation, we are wired for being cutthroat, we are wired for, these are the dynamics, and we were wired, and we, in fact, the P&I thing, you know, is about ill health. It's more about how do you make you heal your immune system. But of course, what we're wired for is ill health. And I remember just as when I went back to university a few years ago to do the therapy specialization, Justice Edward Cameron, who I think many of us know, is an incredible man, right? And he has been pioneering the thinking about why is it that in a South African environment, HIV and AIDS, or in a Southern African environment, HIV and AIDS is so much worse than in the rest of the world, when our dynamics, we're not more promiscuous than the rest of the world. We don't behave, in fact, South Africa, if you look at Southern Africa, we're actually a lot more conservative. So why would it be that in this part of the world that this is happening? And if you take it to a psychoneuroimmunology thinking and go down that path, we understand possibly, and this is my connections, right? So I haven't read this anyway, but possibly what might have happened is that because we have weakened a large percentage of our society, we have weakened the immune systems of a very large percentage of our society, which has weakened the neurology, and we're trying to function healthily from this place. It's impossible. And I was really so that, in fact, my work with Dr. Weinberg in 2011 is what put me on this path of working with organizational trauma, because I realized that collectively we are in crisis. And so how does this, and then the other part, which I believe is a gift for me, is that because I'm a strengths-based specialist and I work with organizational strength and community strengths-based, what I found was that pathway taught me that if we focus on building the health of the system, it automatically generates an environment that will enable the healing and elevate the capacity for healing. So actually we mustn't go and focus on the crisis. Don't go focus on the crisis. Don't go try to fix the wound. Focus on building the health, which is exactly what we talk about in this pandemic space that we're in right now, right? Be aware, be responsible, but focus on building health. Focus on your immune system. Focus on strengthening the environment that enables you to feel healthy, because then it unleashes the system's natural capacity to be resilient, to be healthy. And I think that's our work in our country right now and in organizations. And as leaders, as practitioners, as specialists, it's our accountability to show up.
So Vasintha, this, for me, what strikes me is your, and I appreciate this so much, is the focus on building the healthy organization, because we can get trapped in this thinking of we are so traumatized, and these are all the results of our traumatization. And this is how traumatization is keeping energy trapped and making that we are not innovative, and that we can't deal with change, and that we can't have new ideas because we stuck in all of those patterns. But the question always is okay, so what? What do we do? And of course, one part of it, as you say, is creating safety and holding space so that we can see what is there. So if there's pain, we can see the pain. If there is unproductive or destructive or fixated patterns, we can see those patterns, etc. I think it's the point of we're becoming aware, we're seeing what goes on. It's in the theory U process also, is seeing, and seeing what is there without judgment, really having an open mind for what is there. And then is it Is it Di Norton? I'm just asking what your name is, because you asked an interesting question, and I think it almost relates to this point of what do we do.
Hi.
Yes.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you. And to a certain extent, Vasintha's last point about focusing on the strength of the environment and building from there, versus focusing on what's not working, does to a certain extent answer that question. But basically what I was asking is how to go about working in a situation to offer a mirror to leaders who are very unaware of the environment that they're creating.
Because it must be experienced, I think, for the leaders themselves, as a phenomenally unsafe environment. You've got shareholder demands, you've got the demands of your people, you've got everyone all around you expecting to know the answers, and you're bringing in your own history of how you always act in these situations. And as we had that conversation with Lucille, you also fall back into your worst behavior. And this is now the work, is how do we create this capacity? You speak about capacity a lot. How do we create this capacity for holding the possibility? You used a very beautiful phrase the other day. It is holding the capacity and holding the space that in which there can be an awareness and also a readiness for the possibility that something may shift. We don't know what that shift is. We don't know yet, but something may shift.
Can I share a story? That's so fairy tales is my specialism, folks, in the work that there are many ways to do this work. And one of the ways is to work with story. And I use, like my OD and therapeutics specialism in this context is using story and fairy tale. So I'll share a very high level version of it, of course, because it's quite a deep story. But those of us that are aware of the story of Bluebeard, all right? So Bluebeard was this very He was very scary looking because he had a blue beard, and he was very weird, and he had a very bad reputation, but he was very charming. And what he used to do was he used to constantly get married to people, and then suddenly you wouldn't see them anymore. And nobody, but because he was so charming, nobody questioned it really. And then one day he knocked on the door of this household, and he married the one, you know, I'm going very fast. Things usually take a little longer. But he married one daughter. And then after a while, she disappeared. And then he came back to the house and he married the second daughter. And then she disappeared, and he came back, and then the third daughter got also beguiled by his charm, and she married him. Anyway, she marries him, lives in his house, and then he's going away for a business trip, and he says to her, you're not allowed to go into any of the rooms. Well, actually, I'm going on a business trip. You can go into all of the rooms in my amazing mansion and castle, and you can look at everything, all the riches that I have, but there's one room that you're not allowed to go in, and you don't go there. Anyway, so she goes and she opens all these amazing doors, and there's riches and there's jewels and there's beautiful things behind all of them. And then she finds this very dark door, and she knows that that's the one he probably said don't go into, but her curiosity got the better of her, and she finds the key, and she opens the door, and there behind this, in this room, dark in the dungeons, are the severed limbs of all of the wives that he had murdered before he married her. And she tries to, the long story is that she manages to get away from him so she puts the limbs back, she finds her sisters and she puts the limbs back together, and then they call the brothers, her brothers, and they manage to overpower him, and he dies. It's called a brutal story, right? It's a brutal fairy tale. It's a teaching story. So story is a lovely way for us to make sense. It's a map for us to make sense of how we deal with things and how we engage with things, right? And the way I work with this as a map is go into the rooms where we get strength first. Go in, Christo, you worked with the idea, you said resourcing, right? Is what we need to do as individuals as well, as community, as family, as organizations, find ways in which to open the doors that build strength. And do that over time. Create strength, create strength, create strength, create strength. And then what we do is that when she opens the door and she sees what's behind the door of where all these bodies are, it's the invitation or the possibility that at a psychological and emotional level, we then have capacity to look at the carnage. But first we have to generate a level of resourcing so that when we open the door, we can withstand what we're looking at. And stories, as we know, are maps. They're spiral. They're holographic. So it's like we will be able to look at a version of the trauma, an element of it, and then we'll have to come back to it at another time. And we'll go back and we'll open the door another time. We don't look at it. We don't have all the strength in one go, right? You build capacity. As we build capacity slowly, we develop more capacity to look at the carnage, to look at the trauma. And what I love about the story is what she does is she puts the limbs back together. So what we have to do psychologically and emotionally in our organizations is we have to put the limbs back together. What is the remembering that must occur? To witness. We're witnessing what's behind this door, but what remembering has to happen, right? And that remembering for me is witnessing, is that we can share our stories with each other. We can share our pain and create the space where we can have those conversations. And then when I leave, I actually have more capacity because I've been hurt. It's as simple as that. As opposed to somebody telling me, well, you can't do that because you have a deadline and you have to go and finish that. So our ways of working have to fundamentally change so that we are creating space in organizations for people to come into conversation with each other. I mean, last week, when I facilitated this gender equality conversation, I used a fishbowl. I created a virtual fishbowl where I had the women only able to be visible. Everybody else weren't were invisible on Zoom. It's a lovely way to presence stuff. And I had them share their experiences and just have the men in the background watch and listen, and presence and presence and presence. So there was almost no choice but to listen and to witness, right? And when everybody came out of that process, but of course I built a lot of strength before getting to that. And when we got to, I opened the door to look at the carnage. Look at it. Let's look together. And when we came out of that, there was a different healing. There was a different kind of seeing because it had been witnessed. And then the resolve to go, okay, I see that. I've said the same thing to my girlfriend. I said the same thing to my sister. I realize now, help me. How do I change this? If I do it again, will you tell me? And it's that moment. And we're just looking for that moment, because that shifts the capacity. Then the next time it happens, more capacity. And the next time it happens. And the other part of the story to close with is that at the end of it, she calls the brothers, right? The healthy masculine is able to then, the healthy masculine psychologically is the masculine that manifests healthily, that is strong, powerful, able to manifest in a way that's healthy, not in a way that is unserving to the system. So calling on the healthy brothers means the healthy aspect of delivery, of creativity, of movement is ignited in the organization.
I find this an intriguing possibility that if we work with psychoanalysis and the approaches that comes out of psychoanalysis, that we may actually even create a space where we can work again with the masculine and the feminine without collapsing that into gender, and working with the masculine and the feminine to actually resolve some of the gender issues that we have in the organization, but also other wounding that takes place around diversity and inclusion and non-inclusion. And that's in all sorts of ways, whether it's high, low, black, white, etc. That there's a space for us to work towards, I wouldn't say reconciliation, but a recovery of difference. Because it seems that in trauma, one of the big things that we lose is difference and diversity. It seems that that's what's stripped away, that's what gets compacted. And that this kind of witnessing work may give us an opportunity. I want to ask you, Vasintha, how do we build that strength to go into the room? We don't know we're going to go into the room, although now we know that we at some point going to go into the room with the limbs. But often we don't know that we're going to go, oh, I mean, Vasilisa, was it? No, it wasn't Vasilisa, the girl. I can't remember her name in Bluebeard. But she doesn't know she's going to find this room, although maybe she does actually really know that she's going to find this room.
Yes.
But how we know we're going to find this room? What can we do?
Beautiful question, Christo. There are many ways. I think for us, and again, we need to think about it holistically, right? What is my responsibility as Vasintha to help myself? What might I do so that I develop my own capacity to look at the things in me that might be reinforcing dynamics that are not healthy for me or for others? Very important part of the invitation. And then, because that helps me see how I might be showing up in organizations in a way that is not necessarily safe. And then in organizations, how do we, what would we do? And I like to kind of allow that wisdom to come out of the conversation in the team. And we know as practitioners in this world, the wisdom is always in the system. Our job is to allow for, hold it safely enough so that the wisdom can come through. So conversations, safe conversations, building capacity to have safe conversations. And what I mean by that is teaching people techniques of having conversations that are safe. What happens when I get triggered in that conversation? What do we do then? That's building capacity. If we can't deal with it, how do we step away from it in a way that's safe? Confidentiality, what are the agreements that we engage with in order to ensure that the safety of the conversation is protected? Coaching, leadership coaching, you and I have talked about this, and we're going to share with you that we are running something very soon. But leadership development around being trauma informed and understanding how this is not contributing to a healthy, innovative environment. So who do I need to be as a leader, and what might I put in place that could elevate the things, the dynamics that cause health? Building knowledge, educating, resources. Culture, focus on culture, culture, culture. That's the work right now. We know how to do structure. We know how to do process. We know how to do delivery. We don't know how to do culture. And the OD work of culture right now is absolutely core. In talking about culture, one of the things we do know around what directly, so let me share a couple of technical things. Connectedness. Social connectedness is directly linked to health. So what we know is that with trauma, one of the pathways to healing trauma is to create strong social networks. So in a psychotherapy environment, if I work with the client, part of that is always working with how might they strengthen their network so that they have support in an organization.
It's also an interesting thing of trauma is that that's exactly where one of the biggest losses take place. Is that people lose connectivity and they draw back from connectivity.
And that's why
in organizational level we lose community.
And that's why organizations are such a powerful place, because we can shape community. It's already there. We just do it very mindlessly. So, I think for me, the organization is the unit of change for our world. Is if we can shape that unit in a way that generates health, we will change the world. We've got access to resources, access to skill, access to knowledge, access to people, access to community, to technology. Where else do you find it? So if we can harness that for health, I think we can change our world. That's my driving philosophy. So if we shape healthy teams, there's your community, there's the support structure. If we're having safe conversations, there's the support structure, we're creating it. When I did my master's thesis, I focused on one of the things around leadership development that I focused on is that women, it's not just part of what's occurred with women leaders. Maybe this was my what do you call? I don't know. I forget the question. What the academic word is? My question was, one of the reasons why the leadership numbers are dropping in senior leadership around women is because there's an internalized oppressive dynamic that says we don't belong in leadership, right? And if I'm functioning from that place, then when we get to that level, you know, we're not going to be there for long, because my internalized perception collectively is that women don't belong in senior leadership. And what I found was really interesting. I used, for anybody that's interested in Vygotsky, if you know Lev Vygotsky, he was a Russian psychologist, and his work was banned during Soviet Russia. And it's only, so from the 30s to the 70s, his work was banned. And it's only come out in the 70s. And now his work is kind of taken, education is using Vygotsky's work primarily. But he talks about the zone of proximal development, the ZPD. And in the zone, it's kind of, what are the conditions that allow for healing, for knowledge development to occur? And that in the zone of proximal development is where we have, and why it's taken form in education is because the idea is that if you have people that know more than you, if you have teachers, if you have people that have got more knowledge, more experience, etc., and we have a healthy connection of those people with the people that don't know, then and we build scaffolding, then what can happen, and the scaffolding is the conversations, the learning, the development, the books, the knowledge, etc., then you create a zone in which development becomes optimal. Of course, in a South African context, that's very layered, and we have to think about that very carefully because of apartheid, because of gender dynamics, etc. So the idea of creating scaffolding for me is a beautiful invitation of how might I learn from Monica in Monica's context, and what is the context that is going to allow me to learn from Monica in a team environment. And if we shape these different conversations depending on what the context is, what's the conversation, what's the safety, and we know as practitioners in this world that your design is first, right? You design so the container is watertight, so nobody falls out of it. So if we're designing with the intention that we are going to harness wisdom, we're going to harness stuff that's not so pretty, that's hard to handle, but people are safe in it, we create a scaffolding, and the zone of development gets elevated in that context. And we create different zones, intersecting zones in an organizational environment, which is very much the concept of Gestalt. Hence, the Center for Gestalt Leadership is that the idea so a Gestalt is a unit, a whole, and from a Gestalt psychology perspective, as many of us know, the idea is that I am a function of my environment, and I will constantly influence the environment, and the environment will constantly influence me, and we will, the interaction between these two forces determines the behavior and the health, right? So you're aware of this. So if we are ensuring that the individual has got a space that's healthy, the environment is optimal, it will naturally influence each other to generate more health.
It becomes a self-reinforcing, self-reinforcing process.
Exactly. I don't know if I went a little bit off track there with the question of what might we do or not.
Well, I think that's what might we do. I think we can also be more specific. I think we must tell everyone what we're going to offer in August, 12 and 13 August, for whom possibly, and just before we go there, I want to remind you that much of the work I think that WorldSphere Academy has been doing inside organizations in leadership development and in team development implicitly is about the creation of this kind of context where there's a strong container and where there is open and quite vulnerable conversations taking place to shift the capacity of leadership. And that also goes with the other work that we do in WorldSphere Academy, is the Enneagram work, the work around coaching, etc. But Vasintha, when we spoke there's a specific space for developing this capacity to hold, and I think I'll start it off and then you go into it, but 3 big outcomes is to have an organization that's trauma informed, that's not naive about it, an organization that continuously creates a healthy culture and heals its own culture, because I think that's self-healing or collective self-healing process is incredibly important. And then what we see and what we know from this work is things can shift really quickly. It's not this endless long adaptation process. If we are deliberate and do the right things, we can shift things quite quickly. So you want to say more about that? This is going to be a 2-day workshop. And Vasintha and I are going to continue this conversation and give more in that workshop. We're creating this together.
So thank you, Christo. I don't like to use the word organization. I don't know what word to use, but I founded the Center for Gestalt Leadership. And if we focus on 2 things, we focus on strengthening healthy culture and building capacity to strengthen healthy cultures and to navigate organizational trauma as part of that conversation. So those are the 2 spaces. So one of the invitations is the idea of working with healing innovation. Healing innovation is that how do we shape systems where innovation actually heals? And I think that is to be working in the context of generativity versus what's wrong is really a mind shift that we could stay in and need to stay in order to move the system forward. So Christo and I are very aligned around this thinking, and as part of this design of thinking about how might we have this conversation and what might this conversation look like, we've of course been creating many other things as a result. And so we are partnering to shape this offering on the 12th and 13th. Is it the 12th and 13th? I don't have my dates.
Yes, 12th and 13th.
12th and 13th of August.
13th, and yes, you can. If you're interested, I mean, we specifically we spoke also about who would be interested in this, and I guess it's possibly like the guests you here this morning. I think one of the gaps is sometimes leaders. We want to get more. Well, actually, I want to say managers in organization. I don't want to say leaders, because leaders is sort of vague, and many people can be leaders. But managers, we want to get managers in, but also other people managers who play leadership roles, other people who play leadership roles, OD practitioners, etc. People who are involved in influencing the development of the organizational culture.
Absolutely. And that have power. That have power, because that's the key thing in this context, is that if we can rethink power in a healthy way, then we can make decisions that are different and we can show up differently. Right? So authority is a key area. So the idea, as we're shaping it, and it might shape differently, as Christo said, people that have influence in the organization, that have leadership roles that manage and influence the system. And the key outcomes will be being trauma informed. What does this mean for innovation? What does it mean for generativity? What does it mean for performance? How might you show up? What does structure look like? What do processes look like? What might we do differently in our organizations? And I think there's key techniques. There was a third point, Christo, and I'm trying to look for my notes, but there was a third outcome that we agreed.
There was a very important outcome, and that is around stewarding awareness.
Yes.
Yeah, and stewardship. in the organization. And I think that's a fairly critical shift in the organizations as well, as we run up against the limits of our current systems, and we need to think differently about the organizations in which we find ourselves and that we inhabit. These are not just extractive entities. They are spaces that we inhabit, that provides a space for us to be together as human beings and to participate in, yes, the economy. We are participating in an economy in productive ways in these organizations. I think one of the things is around this is if organizations don't take this seriously, this work, the risks are phenomenal, or what they won't get is phenomenal. It is disengagement and lack of energy. It is incapacity for being truly innovative. We hear so many organizations that want to be innovative and want new thinking. And if we don't release that energy, find ways to release that energy, what are we talking about when we talk about innovation? The capacity to change. All organizations right now are faced with immense challenges to change. I don't think there's a single organization except, well, not even the exceptions that I can think of. Everyone needs to make massive adaptations. And it is this capacity that allows us to effectively adapt and to change and to embark on changes with vision and with enthusiasm and with capacity.
Absolutely. I think in a severe context, right? In an extreme context. So this is important for us to know that this is not everybody suffering. But in an extreme context, a traumatized individual's capacity to cognitively think effectively is weakened contextually. So so I might think, and I've experienced this personally, that's why this work has been such a passion of my own, is because I might think really effectively in this group because I'm safe here and I have a relationship here and I'm respected and valued here. And so I can think really well, but I move into a next context where there's somebody there that I feel bullied by and that is aggressive and I'm afraid of, and my thinking capacity shuts down. So trauma affects our capacity, our cognition completely. It affects our capacity to imagine. How will we be innovative if our capacity to imagine is dulled? Because fear moves our adrenaline and cortisol in the body gets activated in a way that is protective to the system, and therefore play and imagination is no longer what's going on, right? So, and then if that's a pattern, and that's why we talk about our country and we have to think about the context, because if it becomes a pattern, if it's chronic, then the body naturally wires for that. So the situation will be that my threat perception systems are turned on all the time, and that I can come into this conversation and you can all smile at me and I'll be in a threat. I'll be threatened. And the chemistry released in my body will prevent me from being able to speak effectively, enjoy the environment, feel good about it, experience pleasure, because the chemistry is, and if we know what's going on, right, and we have to learn how to step up and look at it from 50,000 feet, because if I'm at threat all the time, it means I'm in defense. And if I'm in defense, I'm going to have a specific reaction, right? What did we do in our country? What did we do for 100, 200 years? We turned people's threat perception systems into overdrive, and we pushed it there, and we kept the button on for hundreds of years. And generationally, we have wired a specific kind of psyche, and we have to change it. So yeah, it's where we are. That's my view. It's where we are.
Yes, and I think it's the gift of this moment as well, is that we can look at this and we can say, here we are, and this is what trauma is, and this is what trauma does, and also this is how we can start releasing some of those defense mechanisms and make them less overpowering and less habitual, and open up the energy for different possibilities, imagination, play, creativity, all of those beautiful things. And for me, what came out of this conversation is a re-engagement with the masculine and the feminine. As the yin and the yang of the organization, and our world and ourselves, re-engagement of ourselves inside ourselves as gestalts, inside the gestalt of the team, inside the gestalt of the organization, inside the gestalt of the society. We can become less disconnected. I saw in somewhere Gianpietro Petrieri, I think he's from INSEAD, he said about the need for social connective capacity. Our need to build connective capacity, to make linkages across and between again. And this creates the possibility for that. And we will have better organizations for that.
And I think that's the beauty of where we are as OD practitioners. You know, when we started this, the first conversation I joined with you, when was that? I don't know, Liz or Roy, we started talking in March, right? And,
we started about a week before lockdown, and we're still going.
We are, right? And when I lost my train of thought now. Anyway, yeah, we must build health, and learn how to. And the beauty is, what we were asking, I remember now, is we were thinking about how is OD changing? How is change management, OD, leadership development, like what's the new role that we play? I mean, what an amazing place to find ourselves in. Actually, we steward healing. We can steward health. We can steward this thread in the system. I mean, wow.
Yeah.
So I'm excited.
Absolutely. I want to know there are more comments, questions, Liesel. Then you can just throw it open for everyone.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to just leave a comment in the chat section, you're more than welcome to as well. But we've got some time for questions and comments and discussion, eh?
Yep. Yeah.
I had a question. You know, when you enter a client system and you can quite clearly see that it's traumatized and there's been some wounding, and to then go and position the OD work with the senior leadership who may be coming from a defensive stance, you know, what is a non-threatening way to shed light on that for these, you know, senior executive or sponsors, to say, aha, it's not just the fluffy stuff. My bottom line is bleeding profit. My people are leaving, and the ones that are here are miserable, and we're getting nothing done. You know, just to, without saying you have a massive problem, a more gentle way to start that conversation.
Roy, I think I'm smiling because my first impulse is to run away as fast as I possibly can.
But that's where we need it, right?
It's the hardest thing. And I was chatting with a colleague of mine in the therapy space a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about healing and racism in our country, and the education that needs to occur, the presencing that needs to occur with those of us that have not built the capacity to do that, right? And we were talking about this. There's your question is so rich, and I think there's so many layers to it. The one thing I think is that we have to make peace that we're going to get wounded in this space. And Christo and I have been talking a lot about how do we create spaces that we are supporting each other as we do the work, because it is so hard to do, because you will get projected on. And the anger and the wounding and the incapacity will get projected onto whoever the facilitator or the specialist is, right? So I think there's an element there of we will get wounded in this, and how do we find healing spaces for ourselves so we can debrief, we can be supported, we can find our pathways. Oh, okay, let me trust that, or maybe I could have done something differently. So we don't go into our own spirals. That's the one thing. The other thing is that this mirror that Diane presenced earlier is that I think what we need to do is we learn the capacity of constantly presencing the mirror to those sponsors in a way that is safe for them.
Mm.
And that is a multi-layered psychoeducational. It is statistics. What's the statistics in your organization? Where do you see the pain points that, so we speak in a language that is language that they can relate to. Where are the areas in the organization that we want to see change? And as there's another thing that we talked about right at the beginning in our initial session was, the way I say it, I go in the side door. I don't go in and say, we're going to heal, there's trauma in the system, and we're going to go in the side door. We're talking about collaboration. We're talking about strengthening connection. We're talking about performance. We're using the language of the system in order to move and create shift in the system, right? We know what we're doing. That's the piece. We know what we're doing. Until, like I shared what happened last week, until the pain that people have had gone through the pain, presence the pain, come up for air, and then gone, okay, I can see it now. Wow. Then they're safe enough in themselves for you to say, okay, can you see the carnage? Can you look at it and really see what we need to see? But it's a process. And Christo, and anybody else, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, for me, it seems that it's really important that we are patient and take good care of ourselves, to be these resources, to be there with the resources to hold, the capacity to hold, and then to be quite persistent in the work that we are doing. That it's not plastering things over. If we work on performance problems in the organization, or we work with adaptive challenges, or we work with what people may call toxic leadership, or we work with disengagement, or whatever it is to do the real work. I think this is a great moment. Organization development has always been in the space where we know we're working with the humans in the organization to create a human organization, to do human things. I think much of the expectation is that we will come in with technology and technique and a few pills and shift some stuff. And
or that proverbial toolbox. Can you come and bring us tools?
Toolbox, yeah.
And
we know that.
You said about being aware that us as OD practitioners will get wounded in this process. You know, the self is instrument. We are not instruments only. We are human beings with our own stuff that we bring to the conversation. I think that's...
And I think we have to be very aware that we are so used to using words like trauma and healing and safe space, and it's become so natural for us that a lot of the time the clients that need it the most would rather respond to, would you like us to help you improve the performance of a team? And then the magic of OD is that so much of our work is undercover work. And as long as we believe that and we're okay with it, because afterwards it's not undercover anymore. Afterwards you can see the magic of what was achieved and transformed and enabled and strengthened and healed. And then you can use those words. But I think, if you get the resistance, then,
Yeah, and I think the message to senior decision makers is perhaps around where is the pain. And the pain is, well, the performance is down. People don't know what to do. They're confused. The engagement figures are going down. And by the way, meanwhile, I think the mental health crisis, especially here in the middle of the pandemic, I call it the middle very optimistically, hey? But the middle is a long place. Is the mental health crisis is intensifying, and this is the impact on organizations. If we want to save these organizations, make these organizations strong, we have to jump in and do certain work. And that is, I think that is rationale enough. We don't have to call it trauma work, but there is critical work on the human community and the way in which human beings show up in the organization and come to terms with their trauma and mental strain and loss of world, because this whole pandemic is a massive loss of world. That's important work if we want to stay robust and be able to continue in this present, and not. I think one of the things people get hung up about what's the new normal going to be. Well, it's not going to be normal for a very long time. We got to get used to that.
Absolutely, and you know, part of the issue also is that the model, the dominant model inside of which we sit is a patriarchal, paternalistic, right? So that means I'm waiting for the father to tell me what to do. I'm waiting for the leader to tell me what to do. So that dependency that you referred to earlier is a dynamic that has to be shifted. Now you have a pandemic and nobody can tell me what to do. Now there's a crisis, and who's telling me what must I do? And so leaders are suddenly kind of, and what we've seen is some leaders have been able to, where there've been healthy cultures, they've been able to show up. Some leaders have just disconnected and disengaged completely. Others have become more what's the word? Controlling, more command and control, because now I have to control you from where I'm sitting in another, kilometers away. I'm going to tell you what to do. So that dynamic, or that paternalistic, patriarchal dynamic, it's not working. It's not that it's not going to work. It's failed, it's done. So what do we do in order to steward a different model? And I think my kind of last outward reflection would be our heroine, Margaret Wheatley. I love her talk about the backbone in an organization, right? And that if we strengthen the backbone, in a context of innovation, what we need to be looking at is we strengthen the backbone of an organization, being its culture, being its value system. Because if the backbone of any organization is its culture, its value system is weak, then when innovation occurs, when there's a creative impulse, that impulse cannot translate into realized innovation. It stays a good idea because the system is not strong enough to withstand the disequilibrium that the creative impulse creates and generates. And that's what will happen in this. So what we're doing is we're building backbone, we're strengthening the backbone. And leaders are obviously core, they are core to that because they're the center of the system. So if we're enabling them to strengthen the backbone, that means anything happening around the system, around them, the system, the wobble, the disequilibrium does not cause failure, it causes shift, positive shift. And that's what we're interested in stewarding. See, it's exciting work, even when there's a pandemic. And we're talking
It is. Well, maybe especially in the pandemic. Good. I say, Richard, you have unmuted yourself. Did you want to?
I wanted to say something a long time ago, and I've long since forgotten.
Sorry, Richard.
No, it's not your fault at all. I've loved this this talk. It's been very informative for me because I think I sit in that trauma space, and well, I'm sitting at the edge of wanting to engage with it. And I also think this pandemic time is a good time to be having these conversations, because I think a lot more people are willing to, they've had the time perhaps at home or being more isolated to take a step closer to trauma. And be willing to engage with it. So I think it's a good time. I think people feel like a shift is needed. And if we can let them know that this is a good shift, then maybe we move in that direction.
Yeah, maybe when we go from the chronic to the acute, and the pandemic is acute, then in the acuteness we are compelled to look. But as you say, Vasintha, we may also go deeper into our denial. So it's our work to keep open those spaces, so that people can step forward and step into and engage with the healing work.
Yeah, and why we have to go to make sure that we're doing our own healing work, because to go in maverick. Because I read a book and now I'm going to go into an organization and heal trauma, that's not what we're looking for either, right? And we've seen that damage can do lots of damage.
Because you unleash quite a lot. When you do this, I mean, it's this sudden energy that has been blocked up that's now coming out, and it comes away whichever way. It does not necessarily come out in a neat, clean, nice pattern stream. It brings with it all of the stuff that's under the water. And we have to be ready for that.
That's why we have to engage with this very responsibly, very holistically, and very lightly. There's deep competence, got to be holistic, and it is very accountable, and we have to hold it lightly. You know, because if we're serious inside of all of that, we compound the trauma, right? Ach, shame, Vasintha, poor you, all your trauma. How can I help you?
Yeah, yeah.
Vasintha, what I also love is that you talked about the strengthening the backbone, because I was just thinking, it's not as if the trauma is finished. You know, if we, I think in a lot of organizations, the trauma is still coming, or it's starting now, or it's been happening, but the worst is yet to come, kind of, you know. So it's also not, okay, let's help you heal necessarily. It's that let's help you strengthen.
Exactly.
So that you can continuously be strong enough to open the ugly door and continuously heal.
Because our lives, there are going to be many doors to open, right? And part of this paternalistic principle is that I'm going to save you. And now what happens when you can't save me, right? So it is, what's my own agency? Christo was asked using the language earlier, right? Like, how do I strengthen my own agency? I mean, what kind of innovation could occur in our world? So when Naspers decides 500 people go, but if they were in touch with their agency and they weren't, and there was, the system was supportive of, because it's holistic, it's systemic. And if they worked out, so many of those people could generate new ways of being versus the dependency on somebody saving me, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. For me, that's such a key thing. Is we are in immensely turbulent times, so it's really important that everybody is elevated, as you say. I like your word, elevation. Your agency is elevated. It's expanded. You have more agency. You have a new center of gravity. You always move towards a new place from which you can look around and move into new places. And we systematically constrain that. Sometimes, especially in the patriarchal organization. And we can systematically shift and change those constraints so that there's more confidence and more joy and more playfulness and more courage and more willingness to not be just overwhelmed by what is happening, but to also see what is happening and what is opening.
Exactly.
And that's the kind of work that we all can participate in.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think we've come to the end of this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Vasintha, for joining.
Thank you for the invitation.
And I know this conversation will go on and on and on, and we will have this conversation much more and discover much more.
Yeah.
And opening up much more possibilities and also play in this time that looks so dark. Jump around and bring a bit of light and through all the windows, say like, wow, the sun is still shining.
Absolutely. And Christo, you know what I was sharing with you yesterday, like, because my specialism is creative expression and that's there, and I find that incredible is, you know, in organizations working with arts-based methodologies as a pathway in this work is amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
I look forward to all of that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Vasintha.
Yeah, thank you, Vasintha.
I'm so glad you joined the first session that you did in the morning check-ins, whenever that was, 4 months or whatever ago. I'm really glad you did.
Me too. Thank you.